In the desperate days of 1942, as Nazi Germany tightened its grip across Europe, Britain's military scientists were developing a weapon so devastating that had it been deployed, it might have rendered vast swaths of German territory uninhabitable for decades. This wasn't a traditional bomb or conventional weapon, it was something far more insidious, a biological attack designed to destroy Germany's food supply from within. The plan was codenamed Operation Vegetarian, and at its heart was one of nature's deadliest pathogens, anthrax. This is the untold story of Britain's most controversial wartime plan, a secret operation that remained classified for decades, a weapon that was manufactured but never used, and a glimpse into the darkest calculations of total war. To understand Operation Vegetarian, we must first understand the context in which it was conceived. On September 1st, 1939, Adolf Hitler set World War II in motion with the invasion of Poland. Within months, the Wehrmacht had demonstrated a new form of warfare, blitzkrieg, or lightning war, that overwhelmed European defences with unprecedented speed and coordination. By June 1940, France had fallen. The British Expeditionary Force had barely escaped from Dunkirk. Britain now stood alone against Nazi Germany, facing the very real prospect of invasion. The Battle of Britain raged in the skies above England as the Luftwaffe sought to establish air superiority in preparation for Operation Sea Lion, Hitler's planned invasion of the British Isles. In this atmosphere of existential threat, the British government began exploring every possible means of defence and retaliation. In 1940, a specialised team was established at Porton Down, Britain's secretive chemical and biological warfare research facility located on Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire. The team's mission was to assess how serious the threat of biological warfare actually was, and more importantly, whether Britain could develop its own biological weapons. Leading this effort was Dr. Paul Gordon Fildes, a distinguished bacteriologist who had previously worked at the London Hospital Medical College. Fildes was a brilliant scientist, but he was also a pragmatist who understood the stakes of total war. Under his direction, Porton Down's biology department, also known as the Chemical Defence Research Establishment, would transform from a defensive research facility into something far more offensive in nature. The British government's interest in biological weapons wasn't entirely unprecedented. Throughout history, armies had recognised the potential of disease as a weapon, from catapulting plague-ridden corpses over castle walls during medieval sieges to the deliberate spread of smallpox among indigenous populations. But what Fildes and his team were contemplating was biological warfare on an industrial scale, using the cutting-edge science of bacteriology. Among the various biological agents considered, one stood out for its particular lethality and resilience: Bacillus anthracis, the bacterium that causes anthrax. Anthrax was an ideal weapon for several reasons. First, its spores were extraordinarily hardy, capable of surviving in soil for decades. Second, it was highly lethal to both animals and humans. Third, it could be cultivated and weaponized using available technology. But Fildes needed to acquire a particularly virulent strain. The team at Porton Down obtained a strain known as the Vollum strain, named after Professor Robert Vollum of the University of Oxford, who had originally isolated it. This strain was exceptionally deadly and would form the basis of Britain's anthrax weapons program. The question facing Fildes and his team was not whether anthrax could kill. That was well established. The question was whether it could be weaponized effectively, and more specifically, whether it could be deployed in a way that would cripple Nazi Germany's ability to wage war. In the summer of 1942, Fildes needed a location to conduct field tests of anthrax weapons. The site would need to be remote enough to prevent accidental contamination of civilian populations, yet accessible enough for scientific observation. After careful consideration, the military selected Gruinard Island, a small, uninhabited island of approximately 520 acres located in Gruinard Bay off Scotland's northwest coast. Gruinard Island was perfect for their purposes. It was remote, had no permanent human habitation, and was far enough from the mainland to prevent accidental spread of contamination. The Ministry of Defence purchased the island from its owners and immediately declared it strictly off-limits. What was about to take place there would be Britain's first scientifically controlled biological warfare field trial. The methodology was straightforward but chilling. The scientists brought a flock of sheep to the island. These animals would serve as test subjects, standing in for the cattle and livestock that would be the actual targets in any real attack. The sheep were placed in cages at various distances from a central detonation point. The weapon itself consisted of small explosive devices loaded with anthrax spores. When detonated, these devices would release a cloud of spores into the air. As this deadly cloud drifted across the test area, the sheep would inhale the spores, becoming infected. The first tests were conducted in July and August of 1942. Initially, the scientists observed no immediate effects on the animals. The sheep appeared unharmed by the invisible cloud that had passed over them, but anthrax is insidious in its action. It was not a matter of if the sheep would die, but when. Within 3 days, the sheep began collapsing. Blood oozed from their orifices before death came. The anthrax spores, once inhaled, had germinated in the animals' lungs, multiplying rapidly and releasing deadly toxins into their bloodstream. The infection was swift and invariably fatal. Every exposed animal died. The test was deemed a complete success from a military standpoint. The method was proven effective. Anthrax, delivered by aerial dispersal, could kill livestock reliably and efficiently. But the experiment revealed something else, something that would haunt the British government for decades to come. The anthrax spores didn't simply disappear after the sheep died. The carcasses were burned or buried, but the spores had already entered the soil. Even more concerning, sheep on the nearby mainland, across the water from Gruinard Island, also began showing signs of anthrax infection. Somehow, despite the precautions, the spores had spread beyond the island. Gruinard Island had become lethally contaminated. The hardy anthrax spores had settled into the soil, where they would remain viable for decades. The island that had been chosen for its isolation had become a biological hazard zone. Warning signs were erected on the shore, and the island was declared permanently off-limits to all human access. The experiment had proven that anthrax could be weaponized, but it had also demonstrated just how difficult, perhaps impossible, it would be to control once released. This was a weapon that, once deployed, would have consequences extending far beyond the immediate target. Despite the contamination issues, from a strictly military perspective, the Gruinard trials provided the data Fildes needed. He now had scientific proof that anthrax could be weaponized effectively. The question now was not whether it could be done, but how to deploy it against Nazi Germany in a way that would maximize military impact. Following the successful, if troubling, results from Gruinard Island, Dr. Paul Fildes began developing a specific operational plan for using anthrax against Nazi Germany. The plan he conceived was as ingenious as it was ruthless. Rather than attempting to directly infect the human population, Fildes proposed attacking Germany's agricultural infrastructure, specifically its cattle. The concept was elegantly simple. British bombers would drop small cakes of linseed meal, a common cattle feed supplement that farmers regularly provided to their livestock. But these cakes would be different. Each one would be impregnated with anthrax spores. German cattle, finding these cakes in their pastures, would eat them. Within days, they would sicken and die from anthrax. Farmers, unaware of the contamination, would slaughter infected animals for meat. This meat would then enter Germany's food supply, spreading the disease to the human population. This was the essence of Operation Vegetarian, a name that seems almost ironically innocent given the deadly nature of the plan. The operation would target the entire agricultural heartland of Nazi Germany, potentially affecting millions of cattle across thousands of square miles. Why target cattle rather than humans directly? Filde's reasoning was both strategic and psychological. Germany, like Britain, was heavily dependent on domestic food production to feed both its civilian population and its military forces. The Nazi war machine required enormous quantities of food, and cattle were a crucial source of protein. By attacking Germany's cattle population, Operation Vegetarian would achieve several objectives simultaneously. First, it would directly reduce Germany's food supply, potentially causing widespread famine. Second, infected meat entering the food chain would cause anthrax cases among the civilian population, straining medical resources and creating panic. Third, even if the contamination was detected, the destruction of infected herds and the quarantine of contaminated areas would still severely disrupt agricultural production. Perhaps most importantly, the agricultural devastation would persist long after the attack. Anthrax spores in the soil would make farmland unusable for livestock for years, potentially decades. Germany would face not just an immediate food crisis, but a long-term collapse of its agricultural capacity. The planning for Operation Vegetarian was conducted in absolute secrecy. Winston Churchill himself was briefed on the plan and authorized its development. In 1942, Fildes received approval to begin manufacturing the weapon. The order was staggering in scale. 5 million anthrax-laced cattle cakes were to be produced. The production facility at Porton Down began the delicate and dangerous work of manufacturing these weapons. Each linseed cake had to be carefully prepared and then infected with precisely measured quantities of the Volum strain anthrax spores. The cakes needed to look, smell, and taste like ordinary cattle feed. Nothing could alert the animals or farmers to their deadly contents. This was industrial-scale biological weapon production, something the world had never seen before. By 1943, the production was complete. 5 million anthrax cattle cakes sat in storage at Porton Down, ready for deployment. British bombers stood ready to carry these weapons over Germany. Operation Vegetarian was ready to be executed. British military analysts attempted to calculate what would happen if Operation Vegetarian was fully implemented. The estimates were staggering. It was projected that the operation would kill approximately 30% of Germany's cattle population within a matter of weeks. The knock-on effects, human casualties from eating infected meat, panic, quarantine measures, agricultural collapse would be catastrophic. Some estimates suggested that millions of Germans could die, either from anthrax itself or from the resulting famine. Even those who survived would face severe food shortages. More than this, vast areas of German countryside would become contaminated with anthrax spores, rendering them unusable for agriculture for decades to come. This would not be a precision military strike. This would be a weapon of mass destruction, targeting the entire agricultural and food infrastructure of a nation. The ethical implications were profound, but in the context of total war, with Britain still facing the possibility of defeat, such considerations were set aside. By 1943, the strategic situation of World War II was beginning to shift. The German defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943 marked a crucial turning point on the Eastern Front. The successful Allied invasion of North Africa had been completed, and planning was underway for the invasion of Italy. Most importantly, the United States had fully entered the war, bringing its enormous industrial and military capacity to bear against the Axis powers. Britain was no longer fighting alone, and the immediate threat of invasion had passed. The momentum of the war was gradually shifting in the Allies' favour, though the outcome was still far from certain, and the fighting would continue for 2 more years. As the strategic situation evolved, so did the calculus around Operation Vegetarian. When the plan had been conceived in 1942, Britain faced a desperate situation. The use of any weapon, no matter how terrible, could be justified as necessary for survival. But by 1944, when the anthrax cattle cakes were finally ready for deployment, the situation had changed. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, D-Day, opened a new front in Western Europe. British, American, and Canadian forces were now fighting their way across France toward Germany. Victory, while still costly and uncertain, now seemed achievable through conventional military means. The question facing British leadership was whether deploying Operation Vegetarian was still necessary or wise. The weapon sat ready in storage, but launching it would cross a threshold that had serious implications for the future of warfare. Several factors argued against deploying Operation Vegetarian. First, there was the question of retaliation. Germany had its own chemical weapons program and had conducted research into biological weapons. If Britain used anthrax against Germany, what would prevent Germany from responding in kind? The fear of unleashing uncontrollable biological warfare in Europe was very real. Second, there were concerns about the uncontrollable nature of the weapon. The contamination of Gruinard Island had demonstrated that anthrax, once released, could not be easily contained. If German farmland became contaminated with anthrax, those spores would persist for decades, long after the war ended. Allied forces advancing into Germany might themselves encounter contaminated areas. The liberated populations of occupied Europe could be affected. Third, there was the moral dimension. While war always involves civilian casualties, Operation Vegetarian was designed specifically to cause mass civilian suffering through famine and disease. The use of such a weapon might be seen as a war crime, potentially undermining the moral authority of the Allied cause. Ultimately, Operation Vegetarian was never deployed. The exact reasoning behind the final decision remains somewhat unclear, as many of the relevant documents remain classified or were destroyed. However, it appears that several factors contributed to the decision. As Allied conventional forces advanced and victory seemed increasingly likely through traditional military means, the perceived necessity of using such an extreme weapon diminished. The risks, both immediate and long-term, came to outweigh the potential benefits. Perhaps most importantly, Allied leadership recognized that crossing the threshold into biological warfare might set a precedent that would haunt the world for generations to come. The 5 million anthrax cattle cakes remained in storage at Porton Down as the war ground on. Germany surrendered in May 1945, and Japan followed in August after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. World War II ended without Operation Vegetarian ever being launched. Following the end of the war, the question arose of what to do with the enormous stockpile of anthrax weapons. In 1945, all 5 million cattle cakes were incinerated at Porton Down under carefully controlled conditions. or rather, most of them were. According to some records, all but 2 crates of the infected cattle cakes were destroyed. What happened to those remaining 2 crates remains a mystery. Some sources suggest they were kept for research purposes. Remarkably, tests conducted as late as 1955, a full decade after the war ended, indicated that the anthrax spores in the remaining cakes were still viable and lethal. This fact underscored just how persistent and dangerous these weapons were. While Operation Vegetarian was never deployed against Germany, one location bore the permanent scars of Britain's anthrax weapons program, Gruinard Island. For more than 4 decades, the island remained contaminated and off-limits, a stark reminder of the Gruinard trials of 1942. Warning signs on the shore prohibited any landing on the island. The contamination was so severe that even decades later, anthrax spores could still be detected in the soil. Gruinard became known as Anthrax Island, a forbidden zone in the Scottish Highlands. It wasn't until 1986, 44 years after the original contamination, that the British government finally undertook a massive decontamination effort. The island was thoroughly treated with formaldehyde solution to neutralize the anthrax spores. After extensive testing confirmed the decontamination was successful, Gruinard Island was finally declared safe and returned to its original owner's heirs in 1990. For decades, Operation Vegetarian remained one of World War II's most closely guarded secrets. The British government maintained strict secrecy about its biological weapons program, and the full details of Operation Vegetarian were not publicly revealed until the late 1990s, when various documents were finally declassified. When the story finally emerged, it shocked many people who had not realized how close Britain had come to launching a biological attack that could have killed millions and rendered vast areas of Europe uninhabitable. The revelation sparked debates about the ethics of warfare, the use of weapons of mass destruction, and the decisions nations make in times of existential threat. Operation Vegetarian raises profound questions that remain relevant today. Was Britain justified in developing such a weapon given the existential threat it faced in 1940 to 1942? Would deploying it have been a war crime or a legitimate act of total war? Where is the line between acceptable military action and unacceptable atrocity? These questions have no easy answers. In the context of World War II, a conflict against Nazi Germany, a regime engaged in genocide and aggressive war, many would argue that almost any weapon was justified. Yet others point out that using biological weapons would have set a terrible precedent and caused suffering on a massive scale, much of it among innocent civilians who bore no direct responsibility for Nazi aggression. Operation Vegetarian was part of a broader exploration of biological warfare during World War II. Other nations, including Japan, Germany, and the United States, also conducted biological weapons research during this period. Japan's Unit 731 conducted horrific human experiments with biological agents in occupied China, resulting in thousands of deaths. The fact that biological weapons were ultimately not used extensively in World War II, with the exception of Japan's limited use in China, represents a threshold that the major powers chose not to cross. After the war, this restraint was codified in international law. The Biological Weapons Convention of 1972 prohibited the development, production, and stockpiling of biological weapons, though concerns about clandestine programs have persisted. Operation Vegetarian stands as a testament to the extreme measures that democratic nations were willing to contemplate when facing annihilation. It reveals the cold calculations of total war, where the deaths of millions could be weighed against strategic advantage. It demonstrates both human ingenuity in developing new weapons and human wisdom, or perhaps mere prudence, in choosing not to use them. The 5 million anthrax cattle cakes that were manufactured but never deployed represent a war that might have been fought but wasn't, a threshold that might have been crossed but wasn't. In the end, World War II was won through conventional military force, without resorting to the biological nightmare that Operation Vegetarian represented. But the story serves as a reminder that such weapons existed, were manufactured, and came close to being used. In an age where biological weapons technology is more accessible than ever before, the lessons of Operation Vegetarian remain urgently relevant. The ease with which a nation could inflict catastrophic harm with biological weapons and the difficulty or impossibility of controlling such weapons once released should give us pause. Gruinard Island has been decontaminated, the anthrax cattle cakes have been destroyed, and the scientists who developed Operation Vegetarian have passed away. But the questions raised by Britain's secret plan to annihilate Germany's food supply remain with us, a dark chapter in the history of World War II, and a warning about the weapons we create and the choices we make when facing existential threats. This was Operation Vegetarian, a weapon of mass destruction that was developed, manufactured, and ready for deployment, but ultimately never used. A secret plan that remained hidden for decades, and a reminder of how close the world came to crossing a threshold into biological warfare that might have changed the course of history.